Welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. Today we get unexpected, I guarantee you. Today we get to interview a lady who, in the bio that she sent me, started it by saying that she was human, although people often asked her what the weather was like on her planet when she was a child. I don't know what to say about that, but if she's from another planet, we'll find out about it and see what language she speaks to us. But I would like you all to meet Cassandra Mok, who lives, around the world. She started in Australia. Today, she's in Singapore. She's lived in a variety of countries and really has a great appreciation, as she will tell us, for international cultures and finding ways to get people and cultures to communicate and interact with each other. And with that introduction, Cassandra, thank you and welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, we're glad you're here. So let's get to this business about what was the weather like on your planet. Tell us about Cassandra as a child and growing up and some of that a little bit.
Yeah. So I was born in Australia. For those people who are watching, I don't have what is quintessentially an Australian face. Often it's perceived that, you have these blonde beach people is the typical Australian stereotype. My parents are actually from Malaysia, but my grandparents are originally from China or Singapore. So I grew up in this hodgepodge of different values and expectations about what was normal, what was behavior, what was being good, all of these sorts of things. And it's a mix. It's not just the Australian, it's also the Chinese, but a different kind of Chinese, because Malaysian Chinese isn't the same as mainland Chinese.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about me. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I was always sort of thought of as naughty by my parents and weird by people at school. Things that I did were different. We lived in a lot of places in rural Australia where we were often the only Asian family in town. So, there is no frame of reference for people to sort of be like, oh, there's something different. There's like, people don't all do the same things. Yeah.
So what did you do that was naughty?
Okay, so Australians are very independent-minded and we swear a lot. So I'm doing try and make sure that I don't swear a lot in this podcast. And tend to be a little bit troublemaker. There's a little bit of a rebellious culture in Australia. And the typical Asian parenting style, especially back then, was very, you should listen to your parents, you should be obedient, you should do what you're told, you should follow the rules. And again, the rules are different. So, then you have to follow these unspoken rules about how to behave, and you don't have other people to copy. So when people grow up in a culture that matches with their parents' expectations, you learn some of those rules by watching other people. Whereas when you're living in an environment where the behavior of people is very different from what your parents expect, and you are following the things that you're learning at school, watching other kids and how they behave and interact, then your parents think you're naughty. So, yeah, I was very independent-minded as a kid.
So there was a little bit of a culture clash there, and your parents had a little bit of a difficult time sort of reconciling you and behavior from school and just what kids would do in Australia as opposed to what they would expect you to do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think when my dad went to university in Australia, so he's much more Australianized and likes a lot of the Australian things. But there's also a difference between being something and, expectations people have in their head, So talking back is definitely not seen as something you do, particularly back then in Asian culture. Whereas, I had a very sharp tongue. So it did definitely cause some tension with my parents when I was growing up. But luckily for me, I think my parents have become more Australian, but I think they also recognize that, that sort of independence and that independent thinking has sort of helped me as an adult, whereas as a kid I was probably very difficult. But as an adult, it makes me much more resilient and much more problem solving. Yeah.
And it sounds like they did learn to cope with it some.
I think it's not even just cope. I think it's also appreciate, Coping is sort of like tolerance. You put up with something you don't really like. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's things like every parent has that, but there's, exactly, the appreciation is very much like, okay, this thing that I used to think was bad, I now understand the flavors of it. I understand how it's beneficial. I understand how useful it is. So I think my parents have become more appreciative of some of the skills and perspectives as I've gotten older.
Well, so did you go to college in Australia, or did you do college, or what did you do?
Yeah, so after high school, I went to university. That's what we call it in Australia. And I did most of my university in Australia, but I also went to Mexico because I just wanted to live somewhere completely different. I think one of my motivations to also choose Mexico was that from an Australian perspective, for example, in the mass global media, Australia is seen as kangaroos and deserts and beaches. And while that is somewhat true, it's not true for every Australian. It's not true for every Australian environment. Not all of us have kangaroos in our front yards. Some of us do. And so for me, I was really fascinated by Mexico, which, again, in Australian media was very much portrayed through probably a North American lens, English-speaking North American lens, which was desert, cactuses, big hats, siestas. And there was something fundamentally that I didn't feel, that's probably not true. So what is it like in Mexico? And what do Mexicans actually think? And what is the Mexican way of life that isn't almost a parody of very specific visual elements? So I wanted to experience that. So, I spent a year and a half in Mexico.
So when did you do that? What level of college were you at when you did that?
So I did international studies as part of my degree. So in Australia, we have these things called double degrees where you do 2 degrees at the same time. And so that was my international studies component. So it was the last 2 years of my degree.
Was that a bachelor's or a master's, or did you go into an upper or advanced graduate work?
Yeah, so that was in my undergraduate, but I ended up doing a master's later on, and further academic studies later on. Yeah.
Did you do that in Australia or somewhere else?
In Australia. Australia, I had this grand idea to do it somewhere else, but at the time I had moved back to Australia and was getting my master's, so spent time doing that. My graduate certificate, I did it during COVID. So technically I was sitting in Cambodia, but it was from an Australian institution. So when people say, did you study in Australia? I tend to say yes, even though I never set foot on campus in Australia.
In Australia, right.
But it was from an Australian institution. So,
well, you've lived in a number of countries. Now, you haven't been to the U.S., or have you been here at all?
I've visited. I have a few friends, some who were from the US originally, others have migrated. So I've been to the US. I've been to, I was in Texas one year for the 4th of July. That was
That's an interesting time to be there.
An interesting culture shock. I'll say that. The supermarket was fascinating.
Yes.
I've spent some time in sort of the New England area, California. I think I've been to Colorado. It was a while ago. Don't quiz me about things that I remember. I mean, there was some interesting culture shocks, even small things. I would say, okay, so I'll give you a really silly story, is that when I was young, sometimes we would get these fridge magnets, and you get fridge magnets of all sorts, but food. And to me, it was always really peculiar because the cheese magnet would always be very orange, and the egg magnet, the yolk, would be very yellow.
Mm-hmm.
And as a kid, I was very confused because in Australia, it's the other way around. Our egg yolks are very orange and our cheese is quite light in color. And my brain was like, what? Why? Like, clearly they can do the colors. Why have they messed this up? And then when I was in the US, I was like, oh, your cheese is orange and your eggs are a much lighter yellow color.
Yes.
And so it was little things like that it was just a bit like, oh, that's different. Yeah.
Well, so you mentioned the supermarket. Was that on the 4th of July?
Around there, I think I've been to a few supermarkets because I've traveled with friends or hung out with friends in their supermarkets. So, yeah, different foods, different products. I think one of the times I think I went to one of the really big supermarkets and was just astounded by how many things there were and specific things. I think I had never seen bread that had the crust cut off already before I went to the US, and I was like, "That this is the thing."
When we lived in New Jersey, and we lived there for 6 years, one of the things that amazed us, as opposed to California, was this. In California, there's an aisle that has bread and other baked goods and so on. In the markets that we generally frequented in New Jersey, they had a whole aisle of nothing but different kinds of bread, different shapes, and just all sorts of different breads. It was amazing. We never experienced that kind of thing before. And then on top of everything else, when big holidays came, like Thanksgiving, for example, it was amazing how many people waited to the last second to go and shop. We went down one day on the day before Thanksgiving, and the lines were incredible. We never saw lines like that out here. And we saw it the same every year. People just waited till the last minute, or they decided they needed more. Who knows? But it was incredible. But everyone got along, which was also the other part about it.
Poor planning. Do you think it was more poor planning or panic buying?
No,
like,
I don't think it
bought
was
stuff, but we were going to buy so much. It's more.
I don't know. I don't know that it was either of those. I think it's just the way they did it. And people, maybe they waited to see who all was going to come for Thanksgiving or whatever, but it all worked out and everyone got along, which was really great. Now, there weren't a lot of the kinds of things that we hear about where people don't always get along today in markets and so on. But back when we were there, which was 1996 to the beginning of 2002, people got along really well in the markets and everyone understood it. So it was okay. But we enjoyed it.
I think that there's this concept of scarcity, right? That, if markets or people were planned for it, there was enough things to go around. It normally isn't a bit of a problem. But I think that these days there's also the perception of scarcity because we're so used to having everything whenever we want, especially in developed countries, that when we don't get something we want, and also we have this added factor where our instant gratification is so quickly resolved. You order it online and it shows up in half an hour, that people don't tolerate unpleasant emotions or don't tolerate the immediacy of getting what they want as well. Whereas before, especially before globalization became very strong, you only got certain foods in certain times. And once it was done, it was done. And you didn't always get it. And so that ability to kind of be like, we didn't get it. It's okay. We just didn't get it, I think is much different from now. this expectation, or this, I guess it's an expectation really, that, when I want it, I can get it, and I can get it now. And we're marketed that way too, right?
Yeah. And
we're constantly being told. Yeah.
And if something happens so you can't get it right now, then people get very testy nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
we somehow might not be so good at managing feelings anymore. Especially negative feelings, right? Being able to sit with discomfort, being able to sit with, again, a lot of the times it might not necessarily be pain, it might not be, but it's just not pleasant. And we want to get rid of that unpleasant feeling as quickly as possible. And how will we do it? We will lash out, we will buy something, we will, who knows, do all sorts of things.
Do you find that that kind of behavior exists all over, or just in some places?
Hold on. I'm going to answer that question. Apologies. You'll have to edit this out. I realized I didn't turn off my notifications and it's now buzzing. Apologies. I'm so sorry.
They're after you.
I said I've never
Somebody's calling you to question your ideas about grocery stores. That's what it is. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Sorry. I'm back. I'm going to put the camera back the way it was.
The very fact that you're from another planet, you're broadcasting, we're not live, but you must be.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry. Repeat the question again.
So the question was, do you think that the kind of behavior we're discussing, especially with instant gratification, is pretty much universal today, or still only in some countries?
I think it's becoming more common across the globe, where there is shorter attention spans on media and the ability to get what we want when we want it. I think that there are still a lot of places in the world that is not necessarily true. Before a few years ago, I was living in Cambodia, and there was the expectation that if you saw something in the supermarket that you liked, you should buy it, because there was no guarantee that in 2 weeks it would be there again, and they may not have it for months. I think there was a lot more, when you go to market, seasonal fruit, a lot less importation from different ends of the planet. So you knew what was in season, because all of a sudden there would be a whole lot of sellers selling that one product. So I think that people who are living closer to the land, I guess is one way of putting it. Some people would call it farm to table, that they're buying things in their that are sourced from their more local area, are probably a bit more accustomed to not having certain things, and they're aware of not having certain things, and that's just the way it is.
A little bit more patient.
Yeah, right. Or it's just not that time of the year. Whereas I think that for people who are ordering from very large supermarkets who constantly have a supply of everything, you can get strawberries in the dead of winter, and so it's like, well, why can't I have my strawberries? I really want my strawberries, or something like that.
Even though the quality might not be nearly as good, which is, the other issue. So yeah, you can get your strawberries any time of year, but getting them in the summer and when the harvest actually occurs, they also tend to be generally a lot better. And I think that's another thing that people don't notice that as much, because they're just used to getting it any time they want.
Exactly. Our attention spans, I think, are a lot shorter because of media as well. We have seen over the last few decades that advertising, even on television, let's not get into social media and things like that, but even television ads are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. You have 10-second blocks, 1-second blocks, things like that. Whereas before, ads used to be a minute. I think even the shortest ones were 30 seconds. So people's attention spans and, immediacy is very different. And I think that as a species, we want to solve those itches. And we have started a system that kind of scratches that itch to the point where we don't have to sit with it.
So what kind of experiences have you had in your life that have sort of affected or changed some of your limiting beliefs, your self-limiting beliefs?
Uh, it's interesting where you get self-limiting beliefs from, right? So I've got a story I can share with you. When I was a kid, my parents went through a phase of trying to make their own bread. And I remember as a child sampling things, and I don't know if their bread was that bad, or when you're a kid, you just like the soft stuff, right? And I just remember being, this is terrible. Bread making must be so difficult. I don't think I will ever be able to make bread. And I was probably a kid. And I didn't really think about it because I think my parents gave up on that habit and whatever. And then I had this job working in Vanuatu. So for people who don't know, Vanuatu is an island in the Pacific. And I was working on community development programs. So we were living in a community that had no electricity, no running water. And we had been provided some foodstuffs, and we had to bring with us all the food we were going to take for the whole project, which was about 3 months. And because of some shipping problem, we got some of the food early and some of the food came much later. And we didn't realize that we'd gone through 50% of our breakfast foods in about a week. And so we were in this position where we didn't have enough food. And I remember calling the office and being like, we've got no breakfast. And the office was really nice, and they expect these sorts of things to happen. And the two breakfast foods that we had been given, one was Wheat Bix, which is a kind of cereal, and the other one, which was a very, very Vanuatu product, was breakfast crackers. But they were imported goods that are quite expensive. They're processed foods. And I was looking at the budget, and it was so expensive. Now, in this community, they had what's called a nakamal. So I guess the way you could think of it is like a community hall. When I say a community hall, it's a very large area with palm leaves and totally open air and a pit fire. And their practice was that every month a different woman from the village could use that, make bread and sell bread to the rest of the community so they could get some cash, and then the next month it would be somebody else's turn. So they were making bread with no, let's say, higher technology. It was the purest, simplest forms of bread you could get. It was basically flour, water, salt, yeast. That was it. And they were doing it on a fire. And it was much cheaper to buy a 50-kilogram bag of flour than it was to buy like one box of this cereal. So we decided that we were going to learn to make bread, and every day somebody's responsibility was to make bread for the next day so that people would have enough to eat. So then it became this thing. It's like, well, we just have to learn how to make bread. And the way we did it, and we would make it and then take it down to the ladies and they would bake it for us. I never thought that that would become something that I would become so keen on. So even later on in life, after I left Vanuatu, I really got into sourdough. I was a big sourdough person for a while. Then I would experiment and I would make all these different things, put seeds in it, different kind of flours and stuff like that. But again, it was one of those things that I never really thought I would do. If you told me as a kid you would bake and I would make bread that people would want to eat, I think I would have been confused. But sometimes being put in those positions where you kind of have your back up against a wall makes you realize how much possibility and ability you have. So, yeah.
You strike me as a person who likes to explore, likes to always learn. And if I'm assessing right, what makes you a lifetime and lifelong learner? Who or what influenced you to really adopt that kind of a mindset?
It's one of those things that you don't necessarily think of yourself with that label. I think that's a label that people have given me throughout time, and I'll be like, oh, that's interesting. I had people around me, particularly my parents, and I think parents are so influential in this thing, that they were always learning something, whether that was formally or informally. My dad is such a dabbler. He used to have books. He'd go through phases. He'd like test things out. And he was always very into new hobbies and trying something and learning something. My mother reads a lot. She's a systematic learner, so she's a different kind of learner. But again, she has never, ever had a point, like I never, ever saw a point where they weren't looking at new information, trying new things, experimenting. I think one time someone had said to me in a course, it was for women's leadership, and the facilitator had said, oh, when you're over the age of 30, you still can go to university if you want. And my brain was like, what do you mean you can't go to university? My father did his master's when he was 50. So I think that who you're around definitely influences you a lot on kind of the things that you just do. I think I spend a lot of time with people who like ideas and like talking about ideas and like researching ideas, and they're full of random facts. So that always keeps you engaged with me, like, oh, I didn't know that. And I don't think it was something I was like, oh, I'm going to be a lifelong learner. I think I just really enjoyed it. I get the right endorphins when I learn something new, so that helps. Yeah, and I think I just poke around at stuff. Yeah.
You were brought up to explore, and that's great that your parents did that. I wish there were more people who had that opportunity, or who choose to take that opportunity. I think life is an adventure all the time, and we do best when we're constantly learning something new, sometimes reassessing, but when we're learning and growing, and we need to do that.
Absolutely. And I think that's a big thing of it. I mean, if you didn't have the most adventurous parents, fine. But it is who you are around. And I think you talk about this as well, your parents being quite open with you and being quite encouraging of you to go and do things that maybe other people would have said, oh, you shouldn't do that. So, yeah, I know that my parents definitely, them being adventurous themselves, the fact that they moved to a different country and were migrants, that is a big undertaking, especially before, all of the stuff we have now. I don't think people realize that, younger people, I think older people realize, but younger people don't necessarily realize that you didn't hear from people for months. You got one Christmas card a year, that type of thing. And you were very much on your own when you moved to country. Yeah.
Well, you've done a lot in a variety of cultures. How does all of that intercultural exposure and innovation, if you will, or effectiveness address the issue of innovation? It makes you a more innovative person, it sounds like. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd probably say is that innovation is often mistaken for high-tech stuff.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily, your phone. What innovation is, it's really about doing something new or improving something that exists, right? And it's not products necessarily. It could be how you do something, the way something's done. It could be a service. It could be an idea.
It's also thinking. It's also thinking. Innovation is also something that really begins with thinking.
Absolutely. It's thinking, but it's also perspective taking. So it's another layer on just thinking, because if you think but your bubble is only so big, your thoughts can only go so far. Your exposure to different ideas can only go so far. Whereas when you look at how different groups, and when I say different groups, I don't always mean that intercultural relations aren't always somebody with a different ethnicity who speaks a different language who lives across a border. You can have subcultures. You can have cultures within a nation state. But different people or groups of people have different values. They have different norms. And when you are exposed to that, you understand how that works, why they do the things they do, which are going to be different from what you do or what you were brought up with or what you're used to in your environment. You say, oh, there's a different way of doing that. And when there's a different way of doing that, you can either adopt a new way of doing it, introduce it in, or, you can combine them together with something that you're already doing. So from business perspective, they talk about this a lot. They talk about biomimicry, right? They borrow from somewhere else. So biomimicry is, for example, thinking about the movement in robots instead of thinking that they should move like humans, that they could move like octopuses. So it's the change of how you structure the base information and how the world works. So for an octopus, the way they work is very different from how humans work. But let's not get too far into that, because we'll end up talking about a subject that I'm not an expert. Like I don't know that much about marine biology.
Well, that's okay. But, let's look at it another way. You have a lot of perspectives, and you have experienced a number of cultures, and it helps you put behavior and ideas more in perspective, having a whole multicultural kind of attitude. So clearly you have ideas of the way things ought to be. And, we talked earlier about how today in our world we have people who want instant gratification, and there are challenges to that and so on. How do we shift effectively and appropriately people's behavior sort of in an en masse sort of way?
This is a really interesting question, because underlyingly, groups, societies, organizations, they are made up of individuals, but the dynamics and the interactions change how that happens. So when you have individuals who are looking to change, so for example, people who are looking to get fit or to get a degree or to exercise more or whatever it is, they very much only have to worry about themselves and their own reason for doing it, that they're willing to do it, and then you add in pathways and support. So while there's some of those similar things when you're doing it en masse, it stops being the individual's personal choice and it becomes having a common vision. And we see this in the concept of politics, and I say politics with a small p, is about getting enough people to have the same type of vision that they're willing to commit and believe in, that they are a part of, whether or not they contributed to it or, somebody came up with something that they're happy with. And then even once you have that idea about what are we working on or what are we trying to change, then their interactions and talking with each other have a significant impact on how it's taken up. So somebody who was with you or with a particular kind of change 2 weeks ago, they've now gone and spoken to somebody else and met a new group of people, and they've retracted that commitment or that interest. Whereas normally in individuals, it's only their own motivations. So then you also have to look into things like social proof, reciprocity, hierarchy. So how do all of those interactions go together? It's kind of one way to say it is, if somebody who is popular starts saying something is important and this is what they think about them, people will tend to, people who like them will tend to be like, oh, this is what they said and they've said it, so I'm safe under that. And so being able to both find the drivers and the benefits, which might not be for an individual directly. In a mass change, somebody might be losing something, and this is where it gets a bit challenging. So, for example, if we said something like, we want to provide better educational opportunities for at-risk youth, I'm just making something up. That's generally coming out of taxpayers' money. Yeah. Therefore, somebody has to be paying that tax, which means they may see that as a loss. To say, well, now I have to give up more money. I can't buy whatever it is that I wanted to buy that I was going to do. So often when you're talking about individuals making change, they tend to be doing things that they're trying to get something to improve their life, or they're trying to avoid something that's bad in their life. Whereas sometimes when you're looking at organizational, societal change, you are talking about also trying to have to convince and get on board people who have to have less. And that can be quite challenging. There's also, people often think, oh, why can't so-and-so just do this? Or why can't my team just do this? Or why can't society just do this? And I think that there is often an overlooking of the environmental factors, the physical environmental factors, like how is your physical space created for you to do something or not do something. So I used to work in road safety. If you don't want people to cross a road in a particular place, you have to put a physical barrier there. But there's also the social environment. So what are the policies? What are the systems? What are the procedures? What's the support in place to encourage people or discourage people from certain behaviors?
Right. Well, the other aspect of all of this is that if you are dealing with all this, it really makes it tough to plan or do anything because there's so many different agendas. There's so much uncertainty. How do we get beyond that and find ways to have enough commonality to make plans and to accomplish any kind of task?
This, I think, is, very much linked with the title of your podcast, right? How do you be unstoppable? And a lot of historically how we planned as individuals, as societies, as organizations, has been very much a fixed sort of, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, right? We can have a 3-year plan or this is the task list. And I think now we have to encourage teams, groups, whatever you want to call them, to look more at the vision and the impact that they want to have and tell them less about how to do it, right? So spending more time on the purpose of why we're doing what we're doing rather than, micromanaging or being very task-based. And when people know as a collective what they're trying to achieve together and the dependencies between them, then they're able to sense within their roles, within their communities, within stakeholders, and make adjustments and make suggestions and say, hey, actually, if we're trying to do A, then we really need to think about this other thing that's going on. And it requires this constant reflection of learning and checking in and sort of being like, how can we do this better? Does this still work? Is this right for this context, this group, this whatever it is that I'm functioning in? So really there's quite a lot of decentralization of where innovation or change or decision-making comes from. And we have to do it in much shorter cycles. We can't wait a whole year and say, did this, was that okay? Did we do the right things? Or, you did a whole year plan? Because if something changed, now they're saying the speed of disruption could be a few weeks, I think, now with AI. So if you wait that long, you may have really, really missed the turning point of what was going on in the world. So, yeah, I think that that's an important thing that we have to encourage people to do is to be okay. I think there's an emotional component of also being okay with the fact that things aren't going to plan. I think people sometimes get really stuck and fixated on this is how it should be or this is how it should work. And that ability to sort of recognize and say, oh, well, this is how it actually is, and how can we adapt to that? How can we leverage and springboard off that?
Yeah, we spend way too much time on, well, it's got to be done this way, rather than looking at what is this we really want and how do we get there? And getting people to do more visioning and really analyze that and work as a team is such a challenge. There's so much mistrust or distrust in the world that it makes it all that much harder to do, it seems.
Yeah, I think that there, in order to take risks, I guess, and a lot of change is about what is your risk or mistake tolerance, because when you're changing, you might not get it right the first time. You might not get it right a lot of times. And so you have to have enough of a buffer, right? And part of that buffer might be very practical things like financial buffers, physical buffers, things like that. But there's also psychological safety. And different people have different levels of how much risk they can take. But yeah, people are very apprehensive about things that they're not sure about, because sometimes it's better, the better the devil you know. Like even if I'm not happy with this, or I don't like it, or it's not functioning for me, at least there's a familiarity. And being familiar with something, not having that is a loss. And as humans, we have a tendency to be more motivated by loss than we are gaining. So sorry, go on.
Well, in our world, as things progress and so on, are we relying too much on technology to solve problems rather than being innovative, rather than being more creative, rather than encouraging more visioning and thinking?
I think that sometimes there is this idea that technology is going to save us from all sorts of things. Technology is a tool, and it depends on how you're using it, but it also, what we develop as tools reflects who we are as humans and society. So if we are focusing on tools and technology that helps us collaborate, that helps us be more diverse in our opinions, include the perspectives of more people, then technology can be an aid to that. But I think that sometimes when people think that technology is going to help us, they're sometimes not people who work in anything to do with technology. So basically they're saying, well, I'm just waiting for somebody else to solve the problem, right? And I think that's a dangerous part. It's that absorption of accountability or absorption of power or influence, and saying, well, I can do my bit. What is my ability to move this along? And not everyone is a coder or, building, what I like to call high-tech stuff. But even the way of doing something that is different is an innovation, right? Some of the stuff I really love is what's low-tech innovation, right? Putting a planter over the part of your garden that people keep walking on and ruining the glass is an innovation for you, right? Like it creates a different way of solving that problem that you weren't doing before. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's very much the perception of what technology is and what innovation is, but also the fact that by including more ideas, being open to more ideas, by listening more to people. Some people listen just to prove themselves right, as opposed to deeply understanding, because there's also a false assumption that all logic and all rational is objective. It's not. It comes very much based in how you grew up, the values you have, the way the world works for you, right? And people often like to hide behind science and rationality when it's somewhat of a non-common platform, if I can say it like that.
Well, you talk about people and being innovative and so on, and clearly you, I think, support the concept of team efforts on things. So you mentioned things like decentralized leadership. What is that, and how does that encourage innovation? I think I know the answer, but I'd love to hear you describe it.
Yeah. Okay. So we have some really interesting models of leadership, and let's not turn this into an academic class, but the concept of leadership has changed over time, where leadership was originally thought of management. We still see traces of this, that people say their senior leadership team, and those people aren't exhibiting any leadership skills. It's a senior management team, right? Leadership is not a designation you can give someone. It's not about authority within a structure, right? We'd hope that those people that at the senior levels are showing leadership, but it's not a given thing.
Right. Well, it's a designation you can give someone, but it doesn't make them a leader.
Exactly. And then what we often see in the media now is this, what's called like heroic leaders. This person did this, and, they're like the most amazing person. And that's not discrediting their vision, how hard they worked, the fact that they could put together a good team. But none of those people that we venerate in the media as these amazing leaders did it on their own. But it makes for a nice story. This person who their magical abilities made them, the head of whatever. And I think so when we talk about decentralized leading, it's a very different model of leadership that sometimes people take some time to get their head around, where it's not about a person anymore. Charismatic leadership is actually quite toxic. People say, well, if you have leadership skills, but then, you could use it to start a cult. And it's like, absolutely, right? The ability to be persuasive and charismatic and all of that sort of stuff doesn't say whether that's good or bad. All it says is that you can get people on board, right? And whether you use that for something that is healthy for those other people is not necessarily a given, right? So contemporary leadership is very much looking away from a person and looking more at collective actions towards something. So we all do it together. It's like if you are planning a picnic with your friends, there isn't somebody who's in charge of the picnic officially. No one gives them a title and says, you are picnic leader. People tend to say, well, we want to have a nice time together. I will do this and somebody else will volunteer to do that. Why? Because we all want to get together and have a nice time. And so decentralized leadership is really about not putting things that there has to be authorities always, giving permission or dictating. And it's more around everybody participating, sensing, communicating, right? They interact with each other and they are sharing information so that people can say, we can work towards this and we can work towards that. Or, we've seen this thing that we need to, like someone messaging and being like, it's going to rain. So that somebody else can say, I have a space that we can use that's undercover, right? So it's everybody kind of pulling together in order to get the collective goal. So if you lose somebody, so if someone says, my car broke down or whatever, the picnic's not going to suddenly stop, right? There will be an ability for everyone else to sort of go, okay, we can figure around that. We can work that out. We can do whatever it is that needs to be done because together we want to achieve something.
Again, it gets back to the fact that what we're really talking about is teamwork and people working together. And there's so much more of that would really benefit us all. It is, again, something that we have to deal with. And clearly you're talking about a lot of very innovative kinds of things. People always, or a lot of times, think about innovation relating to business. Well, that's a really innovative company. Crypto was very innovative, and just recently we've seen some real major problems with that. So one wonders about the innovation. But why is it that innovation culture be about more than business?
Well, I think once you start looking at it, there are social needs and human needs that we have, and the things that are easy to solve are easy to solve. We are now getting to a point where our human needs are getting more complex and interactive. It's no longer about teaching somebody how to fish because, the water is polluted and there's no fish living there. It stops being a linear solution. So having, and you brought this up earlier, innovation culture and mindset is really around thinking and playing around and trying new things and testing things and then seeing what works and then adjusting until it really works. And so I think that we need much more creative and, as you said, teamwork, like collaborative views on how do we solve these problems, especially the really big global problems, because it's not going to be one person. One person's not going to go out there and solve climate change, and one person out there isn't going to solve orphan nuclear sites, and one person isn't going to go and solve child trafficking. It doesn't work like that. There are so many things going on that people need to be able to work across different areas, across different cultures, across different ideas and value systems in order to come up with doing the section towards that collective goal, right? rather than it just being like, oh, we're going to Band-Aid solution this and only treat the symptoms, as really looking at root causes and which part of that root cause. And you don't have to be doing all of it, but how are you connected? How are we connected to other people to solve some of these social and human needs?
Yeah, I appreciate exactly what you're saying. And again, it is all about exploration and wanting to learn all the time. So what do you do when you're not, well, let me ask a different question first. You graduated from college, and what do you do now?
So these days I work with people and organizations as a consultant. So I like to call it accompaniment, but other people would call it executive coaching or mentoring or some sort of consultancy. And so basically I work with people and organizations that want to create some kind of change. Now that some of those changes are internal, so around their teamwork, their alignment, the systems and processes, because you can have people in a group or an organization who want to do something, but the policies and the frameworks of what they're given to work in are counterintuitive to how they want to work or what would even be an effective way of working. Mm-hmm. So there's internal change, but there's also external change. So when people are trying to do some sort of social change program or behavioral change program, I'm also doing a lot of strategy around that. I like to call myself the intelligent idiot. So I ask the stupid questions to make sure that a lot of the assumptions are being checked, because often especially when people tend to come from one academic or one sort of background, they tend to see things in one way because that's just the way it's been, and everybody has sort of agreed and knows that that's what it is. Whereas sometimes it's just about being like, well, is that actually true? Is that, explain this to me? And as soon as sometimes people start explaining these things, they realize, oh, it's wait, when I have to explain it to somebody else who hasn't grown up with this or hasn't been taught in this line of thinking, it actually suddenly doesn't quite make sense.
Which mainly also means that you have to take a step back and maybe start at a little bit different level to explain it and teach it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's called Socratic learning. Is that the one that you ask a lot of questions and people have to think things through and explain how they came up with things, rather than just kind of doing it just because it's been done like that before. And don't get me wrong, there's a reason why we have habits. There's a reason why we have stereotypes, right? All of these things take cognitive effort, they take energy, and it's a shortcut, and that's, shortcuts are helpful as long as, you know, people aren't just always relying on them and assuming that they are 100% correct all the time. I think that there's that kind of, we need to challenge what beliefs that we hold and where did they come from and what does that say about us. And I think it's also, sometimes people think that empathy is just what is it, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, which isn't quite the same thing. There is this understanding why somebody's shoes feel the way they feel because of how they grew up, what's around them, what resources do they have. You know, their experience of life is very different. And I think that when we talk about diversity, this is a key thing. We often like to poke at diversity by these things that are very measurable. You know, they're kind of visible or labeled differences, as opposed to even understanding that people come from all these different combinations of things, and some of them might be more similar and some of them might be very different. But how do we get that to come out? How do we focus more on the empathy and less on data and knowledge collection from having diversity, right?
Right.
Not everybody's going to be the same. So, you know, how can we learn from people's experiences? And I think that, and you talk about this a lot, you know, it's attitude. If you believe that everybody has had experiences that may inform the same thing in a different way, regardless of what that experience is, you're going to have different combinations, different solutions, different ways of thinking about it, different perspectives on it, right?
Right.
And that's where you get opportunities for innovation, but you also get opportunities for inclusion.
How long have you been a coach?
I think I did my coach training in 2018. I think this was after. So just a little bit of background about me. My first degree was actually in something called social inquiry. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. Nobody knows what that is, including my parents. But basically really looking at how do societies work, how do groups work, how do you get social and behavioral change, what is social identity, things like that. So that's how I ended up in all this sort of cultural stuff, but also change stuff. And then I happened to, so I was working in the non-for-profit international development sector for a long time and happened to be in a few organizations that had problems and ended up being good at organizational change. And so the organization's mission was still to do social and behavioral projects and poverty alleviation, all that sort of stuff. But there was massive changes in terms of structure, policy introductions, business models, all of that sort of stuff had to happen within the organization. And I was surprisingly good at it. I didn't ever think and didn't ever know. So that's what I encourage people to remember as well when we talk about don't be so fixated on how you think things should be, because you never know what comes up and you never know what you turn out to be good at or interested in, or, the opportunities are there. So I was doing organizational change for a few organizations, and then I was looking at saying, well, if I'm done social and behavioral, I've done organizational, then I should be looking at individuals, because organizations and societies are made up of individuals. So how do those things connect? Yeah.
Which is an adventure in of itself, which is really pretty cool. So what do you do when you're not working? I'm a big traveler, funnily enough. I like to go to other places and experience different, like how things work. So going back to supermarkets, for example, I like walking around supermarkets. Where different places put things and how they group them together is sometimes not what you expected. It's like, where do I find this? And they're like, we put this in this section. It's like, fascinating. I think travel is very much an easy or a good step for people who are trying to think about diversity and innovation and all of these sorts of things. Because when you are in another country, now the longer you go and the more embedded you are, the deeper your experience will be, but not everyone has that privilege to be able to do that. But when you're in a different environment, you are the odd one out, which is much clearer to accept than when you are in your hometown where you've lived for don't know how many decades, right? So when you're in a different place, there's distinct boundaries and you are technically an outsider. So you have that ability to sort of observe and experience. Now, some people go traveling and they're just a tourist. They just take pictures of stuff and whatever, and they're the same regardless. As opposed to having that opportunity to observe and experience a different environment, how things work, the structures. Somebody was commenting somewhere about hook turns. I don't know if you know what hook turns are. It's like where you go, okay, well, see, I'm Australian, so I'm like, which way are we turning? But basically you want to cross across the traffic instead of, so let's say if you're crossing to the left-hand side, like if you don't hook turn, you just stay in the left lane and hang out in the middle of the road, and then when there's a gap, you go across. But hook turns is you go to the very far side of the road and then you wait on the side of the road and then you almost pitch yourself in front of the cross-directional traffic, right? So even things like that, simple stuff like that, it's like, interesting. That's how people think. That's where they do that. Why might they do it that way? How does that work? What are the benefits? And nothing is ever perfect, right? So it's like, well, what are the advantages of doing it this way? What are the disadvantages of doing it in a different way? And I think it helps reflect on yourself in a different place, right? And challenge what you think is normal. I think in this country, I think they call those jug handles. At least in New Jersey, they have those kinds of things where you literally, the way you turn is like the handle of a jug. You go out and you come back in.
There you go. Right.
Why is it? Why there and not elsewhere? Or what's the value of it? Good question, but everyone has their different places.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we've been doing this a while, but I have to ask you one question that came up in your bio. You said that when you were studying in Mexico, you found that a lot of young people didn't deal with contraception. Why?
Okay, so this was a long time ago, so I just want to caveat that for anyone who's listening. It's not like I've done this piece of research recently.
Yeah, this is a long time ago.
Yeah, this is a long time ago, and I was in a situation where, because I was living in Mexico, I had Mexican housemates, and almost every single one of my Mexican friends had somebody in their life who had gotten pregnant unintentionally. And we're not talking about people who, you know, they kind of finish school when they're 13 and there's nothing else for them to do, and they become an adult by the time they're 14 because they're working in the fields or something. We're not talking about people. We're talking about people who finished high school, went to university, this sort of thing. And I was particularly interested in sex health education back then. And so I was like, okay, so how are you having all these people who technically have learned it at school still getting pregnant? And so that for me was a curiosity. So I went and talked to some doctors. I talked to some psychologists. I talked to social scientists around what was going on. And so there are certain things that came up. One was machismo. So if you don't know what that is, that's basically it's a very male-dominated decision-making thing. And so particularly at that time, you know, if you were a woman and you wanted to have sex, you couldn't say that you wanted to have sex. You had to pretend you didn't want to have sex. And then, you know, asserting yourself. So even the example that was given to me was, even if, you know, a woman and a man, they want to go on a date, the woman would basically sit by the phone and wait for the guy to call. You don't call the guy. And so you're very much looking at a disparity on being able to negotiate. So if the guy says, I don't want to use a condom, then, you know, it's quite hard to sort of say, well, I think you should get one. Got it. But then you've also got, you know, like a Catholic country that doesn't believe in contraception. So it's very difficult to get contraceptives. So some places they could get contraceptives, but sometimes it was very embarrassing. And especially as a woman, you know, to go and say, oh, I need to get a contraceptive, there's a social pressure and an embarrassment. And you don't know if somebody's going to tell your parents, and then you're not supposed to be doing this. So it was almost like not planning for it. So not getting the pill, not getting your own condoms because you didn't want people to know that you were having sex because you were supposed to not want it, right? Especially as a woman. Of course, we're dealing with a situation that was a long time ago and don't know how it's changed, but nevertheless, it is what you saw. And it's fascinating that you studied it a lot. Yeah. I think the third component was around the political situation. So very much, you know, the political rhetoric. So it is interesting when you look at certain countries around the world, the concepts of rights and birth control and family planning. It's very interesting around the world. I know that this is a bit of a hot debate in the US at the moment. And a lot of it stems from, you know, certain values, I think predominantly in Christianity, which, for example, in certain parts of Asia, that is not a major factor. Right. So, you know, and I mean, like China had the one child policy for so long. So clearly their attitudes to it were vastly different because of their, you know, kind of political stance and beliefs about things. Well, so yeah, there's a lot of things that affect things that are not necessarily people's individual, but they sort of culminate together to give you a social trend in a culture. Well, if people want to reach out to you and explore working with you and using your consulting services and so on, how do they do that? Yeah, the easiest way is on LinkedIn. I'm not really on other social media, but if you Google Cassandra Mok, that's with a double S in the Cassandra. And Mok so it's Cassandra, and then Mok is M-O-K. M-O-K. Yeah. So best thing is LinkedIn. Okay. Do you have a website? I don't. People can email me, collaborate with Cass. That's with one S. So collaborate with cas@gmail.com. You can also email me. I'm always happy to have a chat with people. Sometimes I'm just keen to hear what people are doing. So if people want to reach out and just be like, oh, I'm working on this, and I want to get your perspective on something, I'm always happy to have a call. So, yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for being with us and spending a lot of time talking about a lot of these different kinds of ideas, and clearly a lot of innovation, a lot of teamwork. And it helps build trust, which is always a good thing. So I really appreciate you spending so much time with us today. And you being in Singapore, it's getting late in the evening for you, or actually early in the morning for you.
It's early morning. It's early morning.
Yeah. So very much it's late in the evening. Well, not late in the evening, but it's in the evening here. So I am going to let you go, but I really appreciate you being here. And I want to thank you for listening to us. Hope that you enjoyed this. And if you can, reach out to Cassandra. She would love to chat with you, as she said. I'd love to hear from you, want to hear your thoughts. You can always reach out to me, Michael Hingson, at michaelhi@accessibe.com. That's Michael, MICHAELHI at accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com. You can also go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. Michael Hingson is MICHAELHINGSON.com/podcast. Always, we really appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rating, and we value your input and love to get your thoughts on this and all the things that we're doing with Unstoppable Mindset. And Cassandra, for you and for everyone out there, if you have any suggestions for guests that we ought to have on Unstoppable Mindset, love to hear from you. So please reach out. We value your ideas, and we will work to bring people on that you suggest. It's a lot of fun to interview everyone. And I hope that you will take the time to give us some feedback and some comments. Also, as I have been telling people lately, if you need a speaker to come and talk about teamwork and trust, and of course, my September 11th story, always looking for speaking opportunities. So feel free to reach out, and would love to chat with you about that. But again, one last time, Cassandra, thank you and welcome to you for a last time. And we really appreciate you being here on Unstoppable Mindset.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun.